see, under any scenario, significant, meaningful job loss in 2024. Unemployment will rise. I go into much more detail with regard to my assessment of the macroeconomic effects of the Limit, Save, and Grow Act in my written testimony. But just to summarize, it will reduce employment by the end of 2024 by about 800,000 jobs and add meaningfully to unemployment by almost a half a percentage point, putting the unemployment rate, which is currently 3.5%, closer to 5%. So the timing here is particularly difficult. Finally, I think there's a path forward, a viable political path forward here. And I think the first thing that needs to be done is the debt limit needs to be suspended. There's no time to get this done before the X date. And I would recommend suspending the limit to the end of the current fiscal year, fiscal 2023, the end of September. Pass a piece of legislation increasing the debt limit. Highly recommend that you increase it sufficiently to get it on the other side of the election next year, because if you don't, the uncertainty that will be prevalent between now and when we debate this again next year is going to be very, very significant and, again, contribute to a potential economic recession. So move the suspension to the other side of the election. Pass a piece of legislation increasing the debt limit, then pass a piece of legislation at the same time funding the government in fiscal year 2024, debate, discuss appropriate spending levels, the composition of that spending, and any other fiscal policy that's necessary to pass that budget legislation for fiscal year 2024. Do them at the same time, get this done, and let's move forward. I will say, of course, all this will not address the nation's long-term fiscal problems. We are on an unsustainable fiscal path. We need both additional tax revenue and we need spending restraint. Both of those things need to happen. But we can't do that in the current environment. This is not the time to do it. We need to end this drama as quickly as possible. If we don't, we're going to go into recession, and our fiscal challenges will be made even worse. Thank you, Senator.
Thanks very much. Mr. Krupp, do we have you standing by?
You do indeed.
All right. You may proceed with your statement. Thank you for joining us electronically.
Thank you, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. I am Fred Krupp, President of the Environmental Defense Fund. With more than 3 million members, EDF is working across the United States and in 28 countries to create transformational solutions to the most serious environmental problems. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The House Republicans' plan to tie the debt ceiling increase to repeal of critical Inflation Reduction Act provisions threatens our economy, our health, and our clean energy future. I'm going to focus my verbal testimony on the proposed repeal of the Methane Emissions Reductions Program, MERP. It's an example of the smart policies and tremendous opportunities that would be taken away by the House-passed bill. Now, methane is the main component of natural gas, and U.S. companies currently waste enough methane to meet the annual energy needs of more than 12 million households. Put another way, it's a third of the gas that Europe was importing from Russia before the invasion of Ukraine. And this gas could be brought to our allies without the need for any additional new export capacity. At a time of uncertainty and instability in global energy, allowing companies to continue to waste this energy resource is just unconscionable. Reducing methane pollution is also the fastest, most cost-effective way to immediately slow our current rate of global warming. Oil and gas companies are the largest industrial source of methane. U.S. companies emit at least 13 million metric tons of methane annually. That's an amount that has a greater near-term climate impact than over 200 million cars driven for an entire year. and cutting methane and other dangerous air pollutants emitted alongside it are important to protect the health of the roughly 10 million Americans who live near an active oil or gas site. So MERP provides a strong incentive to cut pollution with its charge on excessive methane emissions from the U.S. oil and gas facilities. Now, many operators will choose to invest in preventing pollution rather than pay for the excess emissions. That's what we want. The charge applies to emissions from large operators that emit above levels consistent with the industry's own pollution targets. Operators can avoid the charge by just cutting their emissions. Let me stress that point. By meeting the industry's own emission reduction targets, operators would not pay the charge. MERP also directs $1.55 billion to state and tribal agencies, communities, and producers to help reduce the emissions, funding that would be eliminated if this program is repealed. The MERP also supports job creation by keeping more product in pipelines and out of the atmosphere. The growing methane mitigation industry provides the goods and services needed to help the companies measure and then reduce their emissions. This industry has nearly doubled in size since 2017, with more than 200 companies today providing family-sustaining jobs that can't be offshored. Now, EPA's current method of quantifying methane emissions does not accurately reflect today's oil and gas production practices and equipment. Studies have found that methane emissions are as much as 60% higher than current EPA estimate. To fix the problem, we must accurately understand the magnitude and source of the pollution. MERP addresses this by directing EPA to update the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program to incorporate real data that will ensure emissions estimates and MERP's waste charge accurately reflect the total emissions from oil and gas facilities. We need strong and comprehensive pollution standards from EPA to ensure robust pollution reductions from every company, for every community. A charge will discourage wasteful levels of methane emissions and hold companies accountable while exempting those that are in compliance. Congress was right to enact MERP. Our health and the environment will benefit because of it, and it should be left in place to do its job.
Thank you very much, Mr. Krupp, and wonderful precision on the 5 minutes. To the second, indeed. Ms. Hopper, please proceed with your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the Senate Budget Committee, thank you for inviting me here today to share what we are already seeing because of the Inflation Reduction Act and the impact that the proposed repeal of this legislation would have on our economy. My name is Abigail Ross Hopper, and I am the President and CEO of the Solar Energy Industries Association. I am privileged to represent the 255,000 working Americans who are employed in the solar and storage industry. The policies enacted by the Inflation Reduction Act are having a huge impact across the country in the form of new American jobs, new American manufacturing capacity, and improved U.S. energy security. That is why it is essential that the IRA remain intact in its current form. The certainty that the law provides, the investments that are being made, the jobs that are being created are all contingent on the continuation of this statute. Nearly every week, I travel across the country visiting company headquarters, manufacturing facilities, and solar and storage installations. Don't ask my children how they feel about that. Among the biggest takeaways is that the IRA is an engine for American job creation for all renewable energy sectors: storage, solar, wind, offshore wind, and EVs, to name just a few. These investments are being made across the country in states led by Republicans and Democrats alike. Climate Power recently announced that within 6 months of the IRA being signed into law, clean energy companies have announced more than 142,000 new jobs across 41 states. Climate Power has also tracked 191 clean energy projects and $242 billion in investments. Our team at SEIA is tracking announcements of new manufacturing facilities for the solar supply chain that would grow our domestic manufacturing capacity from 7 gigawatts per year to nearly 50 gigawatts per year, thanks again to the IRA. This is proof positive that we are in the midst of a next evolution of our economy, one that focuses on economic growth, well-paying jobs, and rebuilding our country's manufacturing sector. For example, upwards of 40 new electric vehicle battery manufacturing sites will come to Michigan, Arizona, and South Carolina, with an additional 22 companies sharing their plans to expand manufacturing in places such as Oklahoma, Alabama, and Michigan. Wind manufacturing facilities have been announced across states that include South Dakota, Iowa, Georgia, Arizona, South Carolina, Texas, and Tennessee. And Qcells is investing $2.5 billion in cell and module manufacturing in Dalton, Georgia. Qcells also recently announced an investment of $160 million in formerly shuttered REC Silicon plant in Washington State. Collectively, these factories and dozens more like them represent tens of billions of dollars in new investments and 100,000 homegrown jobs across the country. And again, all the direct result of the Inflation Reduction Act. Any threat to the IRA is a threat to these factories and these jobs. The investments also continue to help build workforce demand and rebuild opportunity in low-income communities, communities of color, and traditional energy communities. We've been talking a lot about numbers, and I anticipate we'll continue to do that through the course of this hearing, but I want to personalize this just a little bit. Last week, I was in the great state of Arizona, and I was on a manufacturing floor, and I met a woman named Michelle. Michelle has worked in that manufacturing facility for the last few years. They manufacture tracker systems for utility scale projects. They use American steel and an American company. Michelle's been promoted a couple of times over the course of the last few years, and since the passage of the IRA, there's been even more demand. The company's growing, and the production continues there. In addition to the jobs and economic growth that the IRA has produced, it has also made our country more secure. Producing energy at home with renewable energy and making the materials to deploy that energy here in this country will insulate us from global conflicts and allow us to make needed upgrades to our grid with confidence. The IRA is a landmark law that through the deployment of clean energy is not only building our economy through manufacturing and jobs, but is the foundation of our country's next and greatest evolution. And that, my friends, is real energy dominance.
Thank you, Ms. Hopper. With consent, I would like to put an additional exhibit into the record supplementing your testimony, which represents the investment and jobs in states represented by members of this committee since the passage of the IRA. And spoiler alert, it's over 56,000 jobs just in states that this committee represents, and nearly $60 billion in investment. And with that, we turn to Mr. Riedel.
Good morning, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in today's hearings in a committee where I have many fond memories of staffing so many hearings back when I was chief economist to Senator Portman. Today, I will make three main points. First, that the current debt path is unsustainable and requires immediate attention. Second, that there is a long and bipartisan history of attaching deficit reforms to debt limit bills. And third, that ultimately the debt limit must be raised no matter what. On that first point, the debt is totally unsustainable. The deficit will likely settle in around $1.5 trillion this year and approach $3 trillion within a decade, even assuming peace, prosperity, and low interest rates. This comes to $20 trillion in new spending new borrowing over the decade, even if the 2017 tax cuts expire on schedule. The long-term projections are even worse. CBO forecasts a staggering $114 trillion in deficits over the next 30 years, pushing the debt to nearly 200% of GDP. Virtually the entire projected shortfall comes from Social Security and Medicare systems that CBO forecasts will run a deficit of $116 trillion over the next 30 years. Those two programs themselves will run a 13% of GDP deficit by 2052. Even under those baseline assumptions of low interest rates, interest costs will set a record share of GDP within a decade and consume half of all tax revenues within 3 decades. If interest rates rise, as we're seeing, each percentage point will add $3 trillion over the decade and $30 trillion over 30 years. That's each percentage point. By that point, interest costs would consume easily 70 or even 100% of tax revenues. With respect to interest rates and soaring debt, we are sitting on a ticking time bomb. Congress should be working diligently to avert an otherwise inevitable debt crisis. And raising the debt limit has historically been one opportunity to address the underlying debt problem. For decades, the debt limit served as a legitimate tool for both Republicans and Democrats to address deficits. Debt showdowns were relatively rare. Debt limit showdowns were relatively rare because both sides recognized the need to include fiscal reforms. Indeed, of the 8 largest deficit reduction laws since 1985, all 8 were attached to debt limit bills. This includes both Gramm-Rudman laws in the 1980s, the 1990 Bush tax hikes, the 1993 Clinton tax hikes, the 1997 Balanced Budget Act, the 1996 line item veto law, the 2009 PAYGO law, and the 2011 Budget Control Act. Every single one of those deficit reforms was attached to a debt limit hike. Many of these laws occurred in the 80s and 90s, when a 6% of GDP deficit, kind of similar to today, was eliminated and turned into a budget surplus by 1998. Clearly, both parties have gotten away from using the debt limit to address red ink, just as both parties bear responsibility for the past decade's deficits. But the unsustainable debt means that all legislative avenues should again be open. This is perhaps why a new survey shows that 70% of voters, including 58% of Democrats, agree with the statement that, quote, President Biden should agree to negotiations and try to find common ground around the debt ceiling, including some reductions in government spending, end quote. Just 26% believe the president should resist negotiating and demand a clean debt ceiling hike. All that said, I agree the debt limit must be raised on time, no matter what. Hitting the debt limit would force an immediate 20% cut in federal spending and possibly default on the national debt. The effect on families, businesses, financial markets, and the broader economy would be devastating. Hitting the debt limit is not a solution to soaring debt. It must be raised. In fact, replacing the debt limit should be an option, but only if Republicans and Democrats can come up with an alternative process that would allow members to vote on the entire budget with the true ability to trade off between competing tax and spending priorities. You see, right now, the debt limit, as flawed as it is the only real true lawmaker vote available that truly covers and trades off the whole federal budget. If we don't want lawmakers to use this risky and flawed process to address soaring deficits, then let's debate and come up with a better budget process tool to have these debates and trade-offs. Thank you.
Hear, hear on the better budget process.
Thank you, sir.
Next, Dr. Fichtner, please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Whitehouse, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. My name is Jason Fichtner. I am Vice President, Chief Economist at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And apparently all the economists came today with 3 main takeaways for you. So for my testimony, I hope to leave you with the following 3. First, Congress must raise the debt ceiling. Second, the nation's debt is on an unsustainable trajectory and action must be taken now. Further delay will only make the problem worse and the necessary corrections more harmful to the country and to the most vulnerable in our society. And third, raising the debt ceiling and tackling the fiscal challenges facing our nation will require both a bipartisan effort and presidential engagement. Turning to these 3 takeaways in slightly more detail. First, again, Congress must raise the debt ceiling, period, full stop. Taking the nation near the brink of defaulting on any payment obligations or going over the cliff and failing to make any obligated payments will cause unnecessary fiscal expense, potentially damage the full faith and credit of the United States, and cause financial harm to millions of Americans. Even under a situation where the Department of Treasury can prioritize certain payments, such as interest on the debt and Social Security benefit payments, the problem of paying the rest of the nation's bills remain. Second, the nation's debt is on an unsustainable trajectory. According to the Congressional Budget Office, this year's deficit is estimated to be $1.4 trillion, with annual deficits averaging $2 trillion over the next 10 years. A $1.4 trillion deficit is slightly higher than the $1.2 trillion we spent on Social Security benefits last year. Further, the national debt now stands at just over $31 trillion. It's hard to comprehend a number this large. As an illustration, imagine you had $100 bills. I'm sure everyone here has a $100 bill in their pocket. A $10,000 stack of $100 bills would measure about a half-inch thick. A pile of $100 bills totaling $1 million would fit inside a standard school backpack, while $100 million would fit on a standard construction pallet. And $1 billion of $100 bills would be 10 standard construction pallets. But $1 trillion of $100 bills, $1 million, 1,000 billion, would require 1,000 of these $1 billion pallets, which double stacked would take up an entire football field. That's $1 trillion. There are 32 football teams in the National Football League, just enough NFL home stadiums to hold the nation's $31.46 trillion national debt if we printed it in $100 bills. Our fiscal problem is real. According to CBO, the national debt is on track to exceed $46 trillion in 2033, or 118% of GDP. The interest payments alone will near $1.5 trillion in 2033, more than our nation is planning to spend on national defense at that time. Third, bipartisan cooperation is imperative. If you are not sitting at the table, you are not negotiating. While the debt limit is not a good mechanism to facilitate the necessary and thoughtful conversation on addressing the nation's fiscal challenges, it is the opportunity currently present and available. I encourage members of the House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans, and President Biden to sit down and negotiate before the Treasury Department runs out of options to continue making full payments on the government's obligations. Finally, I would add that it's critically important for the U.S. to avoid future debt ceiling brinkmanship. My BPC colleagues and I proposed a solution, which I addressed in my written testimony, which I ask, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, that my written testimony be submitted into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The written testimony of all witnesses will be a matter of the record.
And since I have 1 minute remaining, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Grassley, I want to take a few moments to personally thank you. The last time I testified before both of you was back in February of 2020, right before COVID hit, and it was before the Senate Finance Committee. I was a nominee for the Social Security Advisory Board, and while my nomination never received a vote on the floor, I did pass favorably out of committee with both of you recommending me for confirmation. So I appreciate then, and I appreciate now your support and also your willingness to reach across the aisle. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, and we appreciate your being here and your long work in this cause.
Thank you.
And to the issue of getting rid of this debt limit bear trap in the bedroom, again, here. Mr. Zandi, we are being presented by House Republicans with curtain number 1 and curtain number 2. Behind curtain number 1 is default. You have assessed that as financial calamity, as I understand it. Is that correct?
That's the word, yeah.
It would pitch us into recession,
Severe recession.
severe recession, and it would cost perhaps 1 million jobs.
That's a short period of default, yeah,
Correct. Longer period of default, much more job loss.
correct.
Behind curtain number 2 is Speaker McCarthy's what we call Default on America Act. You assess the economic harm to America of that bill, if it were to pass, as also very severe, correct?
Yeah, it would put the economy on the brink of recession, if not in recession, yes.
And knock $141 billion off of our GDP,
Correct. Close to 800,000 jobs.
and
by the end
nearly
of
800,000 Americans would lose their jobs if this bill were to pass.
Correct.
For the record, the MAGA extremists in the House who were essential to McCarthy's speakership have said that nothing less then the Default on America option will pass. Just so it's clear, those are the two options that the extremists in the House are now presenting us. Ms. Hopper, in simple terms, layman's terms, what becomes of the American solar industry if the Default on America bill were to pass?
If the Default on America bill were to pass, or as you call it, all of the investment that we anticipate, both in solar deployment and in solar manufacturing, would not take place. So the 50 gigawatts of investment, the over 100,000 jobs in solar manufacturing alone would not happen.
Would it be fair to describe that as crashing the American solar industry?
It certainly would be fair to describe it that way, and it would also be fair to describe it as just gutting the vision of rebuilding the domestic manufacturing base here in the United States.
And just for my purposes, it comes as no surprise that a bill from House Republicans, of whose 315 pages, 275 are dedicated to handouts to the fossil fuel industry, would, if implemented, also crash their competition, the solar industry. I think that that is not coincidental. Mr. Krupp, what does it tell you when 275 out of 315 pages of this bill are dedicated to handouts and favors for the fossil fuel industry?
Well, to me, Mr. Chairman, it would have the effect of causing tremendous more pollution, and it's just unconscionable, because it's not just the pollution. As I said in my testimony, we are wasting gas that Europe needs. How, I don't understand how anyone in any party could be in favor of repealing this.
Where is the methane leakage support caucus to be found?
Well, usually they're hiding, Senator.
I've never heard from them. I've never heard a colleague say, you know what, methane leakage is a really good thing. We're for that. And yet here we are with a bill that does exactly that. It repeals the measure we just passed to constrain methane leakage in the economy. To me, that is yet another measure of extremism. And extremism in the service of default, or put it the other way, default in the service of extremism, is a place we should not be going. And I'm delighted that all three of the economists firmly agree that default is not an option, no matter what. With that, I'll yield to my ranking member, Senator Grassley, for his 5 minutes, and then to Senator Murray.
Just one statement before I get to Mr. Fichtner, Dr. Fichtner. And that's for everybody to think about what we've heard about the dire consequences of the solar industry. I never heard those dire consequences stated when we all agreed and worked with the industry to phase out the tax credit that was going to happen on 2022 until it was extended in recent legislation. And that was a multi-year phase out. For you, Dr. Fichtner, it's interesting how we only hear about brinksmanship when it's Republicans who want to negotiate a debt ceiling. I'd note that Senator Schumer's bill lifts the debt limit through the end of 2024, maybe to maintain their leverage if we have a Republican president in 2025. So to you, is it fair to say that both parties have the debt ceiling used as leverage in negotiations?
It is fair to say that, Senator, and I would add then because of that, that's one reason why in any negotiation, whatever we do with the debt ceiling should be pushed off, as Dr. Zandi said, till after the election. And I would go one further and say it no longer does what it's intended to do. It doesn't control spending, so let's just get rid of the debt ceiling altogether.
And the chairman mentioned the what used to be called ENZI White House, now White House something that I want to help him with. I would like to see us
Looking forward to it being White House Grassley, Senator.
deal with those things. I don't think you're going to have a problem for me.
Good.
Okay. To Mr. Rito, as I mentioned, Democrats have no problem using the debt ceiling as leverage in negotiations with Republican presidents. What did Democrats demand and get in exchange for raising the debt ceiling under President Trump?
Thank you, Senator. The debt limit was raised 3 times under President Trump. Twice it was attached to large spending bills, raising the spending caps by $620 billion over 4 years. And once it was part of a bill that included disaster aid spending. I'd add, even with that spending, the majority of House Democrats still voted against the 2018 debt limit hike. And if we just want to go back a little further, there were 3 clean debt limit hikes under President Bush with a full Republican Congress. And House and Senate Democrats voted against those clean debt limit hikes at a 98.8% rate, including then Senators Obama and Biden. So I think it's fair to conclude that neither party's hands are really clean on debt limit hikes.
To you also, President Biden likes to claim that he's lowered the deficit, a falsehood repeated so often that the Washington Post awarded him what's called a bottomless Pinocchio rating. You've been critical of fiscal legacies of presidents in both parties. What do you make of President Biden's track record on the budget?
Thank you. I mean, in all my report, I've done reports scoring presidential records of Democrats and Republicans, and the proper measure is against the baseline the president inherited. Because something like one-time pandemic spending expiring on schedule is not new deficit reduction. When President Biden was elected, CBO forecast deficits of $2.3 trillion and then $1.1 trillion. Instead, we got $2.8 trillion and $1.4, which is $800 billion higher than the baseline. Overall, as you mentioned earlier, when President Biden was inaugurated, CBO forecast $14 trillion in deficits over 10 years, and now they're forecasting $20 trillion in deficits over the same 10-year period. $5 trillion of that increase has come directly from legislation and executive orders, pushing deficits towards $3 trillion. So in that context, I don't think keeping the deficit below a past one-time pandemic spike is really the right measure.
And then also to you, CBO and Joint Committee on Taxation released their scores of the House bill. They revealed that many of the new tax credits in last year's partisan reconciliation bill are actually going to cost much more than initially advertised. Knowing what we know now, was last year's reconciliation bill, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the fiscally responsible legislation supporters portray it to be?
Well, at the time of enactment, CBO scored the bill as saving $238 billion over the decade, including the IRS revenues. Now, OMB says the same bill is going to add $216 trillion to 10-year deficits. Much of that change is due to the electric vehicle incentives that were originally scored by JCT as $14 trillion and are now estimated by Goldman Sachs and Brookings as costing $390 billion over 10 years. So no, the law at this point does not appear to be a deficit reducer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Murray.
Well, thank you, Chair Whitehouse, for holding this really important hearing, because the stakes are really high and the clock is ticking. We have, as we all know, till June 1st to raise the debt ceiling. That is weeks away. The American economy right now is heading for a cliff, and last week the House Republicans voted to drive it off full speed ahead. This should not be hard. When you are heading for a cliff, you turn the wheel. You don't say, well, I'll turn the wheel if you let me cut the brakes or disable the airbags or trash the engine. But that is essentially what the House Republicans are offering us. Mr. Chairman, you called it door 1 or door 2, I believe, because House Republicans are saying, if you don't let us wreck the economy and whittle down essential government services to the point where we're laying off people like our air traffic controllers, then we will just wreck the economy by refusing to pay the bills instead. Make no mistake, it doesn't matter who you vote for, what state you live in, or what you make. If House Republicans get their way, it is going to make your life worse. The cuts they are proposing in the Default on America Act won't just kick families off food benefits or rip away housing support for veterans. It will gut funding that keeps our planes in the skies, trains on the rails, our food and medicine safe, our cops on the street, and helps get deadly fentanyl off of them. And despite Republicans protesting, the reality is that this bill will not protect veterans from cuts. Just read it. What House Republicans passed does nothing to protect the benefits and support that veterans have earned and are counting on to get housing or higher education or start a business. The Default on America Act doesn't even protect veterans' health care, one of our fundamental obligations to the men and women who put their lives on the line for our country. It just cuts across the board: medical research, child care, workforce training, disaster relief, border security, small business grants. Cut. That is their big idea. That is the Default on America Act that House Republicans are taking our economy hostage for. Except that's only half of it, because House Republicans are also demanding spending caps that will lock in even more cuts over the next decade. That is 10 years of our competitors who are going to be investing in their economies, growing stronger and gaining ground, while House Republicans tie our hands and force us to fall further and further behind. A lost decade for America. That is what MAGA Republicans are proposing. What House Republicans have voted for is one massive gift to the Chinese government. Because guess what? Our competitors are not debating whether to pay their debts or wreck their economy. They are not debating whether to invest in their future or cut and cap the investments that keep them competitive. They are doing everything they can to get ahead. So I'm asking my Republican colleagues here at the brink of economic calamity, do not let Speaker McCarthy's partisan hostage-taking win the day and lose the 21st century. Do not force an unprecedented economic crisis on our country in a vain attempt to slash funding for families and veterans and communities across America. Come to the table, work with us to simply pay our country's bills like we have so many times before, including 3 times under the last president. And then let us work together on our bipartisan spending bills that invest in America and keep us moving forward, which is, I will tell my committee members, exactly what we are focused on doing in the Senate Appropriations Committee. So with that, Mr. Zandi, or Dr. Zandi, let me ask you, can you speak to the potential macroeconomic damage of House Republicans' Default on America Act, both to our economy and our nation's competitive edge on the world stage over the next decade?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I think there's two broad macroeconomic issues. One I mentioned in my oral remarks, and that is the cuts are going to occur later this year under the legislation that's been passed by the House later this year in 2024, when the economy is going to be very, very fragile, at risk of going in recession, grappling with the higher interest rates, the banking crisis, and now the drama related to the debt limits starting to do damage in the financial markets, and I suspect will do significantly more damage before lawmakers act and increase the limit. So the risks here are quite significant in the near term. The second macroeconomic impact that I think is worth considering is if you do the arithmetic, the cuts to non-discretionary defense, discretionary non-defense spending will take the spending from 3.5% of GDP currently down to 2%, and 3.5%, by the way, is less than its average over the past 50, 60 years. So this isn't really, this is a place where spending has remained very restrained and not grown more quickly than the economy. It's been equal to the economy. But under the Limit, Save, Grow Act, it would fall to 2% of GDP by the end of the decade. And of course, this goes to very significant cuts to all of the things that you described, everything from healthcare and education training, NASA, national parks, things that I think Americans count on as essential services and critical income support. And that would be incredibly difficult for the economy to digest. And at the end of the day, would not address our long-term unsustainable fiscal situation.
Thank you. And take away our competitive edge.
And severely limit our competitive edge, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murray. My friend Senator Kennedy is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know any fair-minded person that wants us to default on America's debt. You don't have to be Mensa material to understand that the consequences would be terrible. And I want to thank President Biden for agreeing to meet with the Speaker. I thought he should have done it sooner. You can only be young once, but you can always be immature. And I thought he was being a trifle immature. I hope he'll negotiate in good faith. Please, 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 Mr. President, negotiate in good faith. Please, with sugar on top. I don't think you want to be responsible for defaulting on America's debt. I believe you're better than that. Mr. Rydell, let me ask you a couple of questions. Did you know that since the 1950s, we have had 10 periods of disinflation in America? Did you know that?
Did not have that exact number, but that makes sense.
Okay, and disinflation is when inflation is too high and we have to reduce the rate of growth of inflation. Mm-hmm. It's not deflation where prices go down. We just reduce the rate of growth. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And did you know that if you look at history, at all 10 of these times when we had to reduce inflation, that in order to get inflation down 2%, we had to raise, on average, the Federal Reserve had to raise interest rates such that it raised unemployment about 3.6%. Did you know that?
That sounds similar to what Mr. Summers has said. He's made similar points. That sounds very correct.
Okay. All right. So the current unemployment rate is 3.5%, is it not?
Yes.
And the current inflation rate is 5%, is it not?
Approximately, yes.
So if history tells us in order to get inflation down 2%, the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rates such that it increases unemployment 3.6%, then if you do the math, given that the current unemployment rate is 3.5% and the current inflation rate is 5%, that would indicate, would it not, that the Federal Reserve, if history is any indication, will probably have to eventually raise interest rates to between 7 and 8%. Is that correct?
It could have to go that high, depending on how the economy responds to current rate hikes.
Okay. Now, can we agree that the best way to get inflation down is to attack it on the fiscal side and the monetary side?
Absolutely.
Okay.
The Federal
We can
Reserve
agree
has
on that?
tool, which is
We
to
can agree on
grind
that?
the economy into a recession.
Okay, we can agree on that. And when you attack it on the monetary side, the Federal Reserve raises interest rates. It's trying to slow the economy. It doesn't want to, but the way you measure the slowing of the economy is the unemployment rate. When you attack it on the fiscal side, you reduce your rate of growth of spending and debt accumulation. Did I describe that right?
You did.
So is it not the case that if you vote against slowing the rate of growth of spending and debt accumulation, you're voting to raise interest rates even higher, are you not?
Generally, I would agree with that approach, with that viewpoint. Yes.
I mean, that's just basic economics 101, right?
Right. The Federal Reserve's tool is.
I mean, that's something
to grind
Senator
the economy
Portman
into a
taught you, didn't he?
recession. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. All right, let me ask a couple more questions.
Mm-hmm.
So putting aside all the politics here, we're talking about people's lives. If we don't reduce the rate of growth of spending and debt accumulation, Jay Powell's going to do what he's got to do to get control of inflation. And he's going to keep raising rates. And that's going to put people out of work. He doesn't want that. But if he has to raise rates to between 7 and 8%, then that could put 6, 7, 8 million people out of work. Dr. Zandi, I have to ask you this. You made some pretty bold predictions today, and some of them I agree with and some of them I don't. But were you at Moody's in the mid-2000s when Moody's graded a lot of these mortgage-backed securities, AAA and A, good as gold, that promptly tanked and almost dragged down the world economy? Were you there then?
No,
Or was that before your time?
It was before my time. I sold my company to Moody's in late '05.
I'm glad you missed that.
Yeah.
If you were there, Let me ask you.
And actually, if you're interested, I can send you a couple studies I did at the
Please do.
time that you would
That'd be
find
great.
very interesting.
I wish Moody's had them then.
Yeah.
Ms. I can't see your name. I can't see.
Hopper.
Ms. Hopper. Ms. Hopper, I love solar energy. I just want you to know that. And I love electric cars. But I got to ask you this question. I've been waiting to ask this. If electric cars are so swell, how come government has to pay people to drive them?
So I think, as like most government policies, right, are put in place to incent certain behaviors, and so that's part of the policy is that if we want more electric
But if they're
cars,
so swell, why couldn't they, just in a competitive market, people, why wouldn't they be choosing electric cars over internal combustion engine cars?
I think
Why do we have to pay people to drive them?
But I wouldn't characterize it as paying people to drive them, but I would.
Well, sure we are. We're
I would
giving a big old
characterize
tax
it
credit.
as the government having a policy to incent more purchase of electric vehicles.
Okay.
Senator
I'm out of
Stabenow.
time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd love to talk about EVs at another time here. I wish we had a tax credit that actually worked that we passed. So, but let's talk about an extremely serious issue this morning. And I'm glad my friend raised the issue of Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell and what might happen. Let me just quote again what he said yesterday to the press. No one should assume that the Fed can really protect the economy and the financial system or our reputation globally from the damage that a U.S. default might inflict. We shouldn't even be talking about a world in which the U.S. doesn't pay its bills. I think it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I just came from an agriculture committee meeting, Mr. Chairman, and I can tell you it was on credit and crop insurance, and nobody there thought it was a good idea for farmers and ranchers to see their interest rates go up, which will happen. So this is a very, very serious thing. And unfortunately, we know that last week, House Republicans pushed our country closer to this default, this catastrophic default and chaos that would arise from it. And I think over and over again that we need to stress that while Republican colleagues are concerned about the debt, we know that about 25% of all the debt of the country ever came from 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency, of which folks voted for. But at that time, it was about billionaires and large corporations getting big tax cuts. So if we want to have a real discussion about revenues and spending, that's great. That's great. Let's do that. Don't default, but let's have that debate about what's fair for the majority of American people, including the fact that the largest corporations and billionaires should just pay their fair share like everybody in Michigan. That's all. We just want folks to pay their fair share. But instead, we are seeing this bill, the Default on America Act, targeting millions of working families. So many things I don't even know, Mr. Chairman, how to go through all of them. I will just mention 3. 1 million seniors no longer getting Meals on Wheels. Actually, that's a pretty big deal if you want to eat for an awful lot of seniors that are homebound in our country. 30,000 law enforcement jobs gone. What does that do to our public safety? 80,000 VA jobs. How do we do veterans health care if that's cut? And when we talk about all of this, 7 million jobs lost, unemployment over 8%, more than double, higher mortgage, car payments, lower 401ks, and so on and so on. This is not a good idea. When we're coming out of a pandemic, we're seeing the fastest growth ever in a generation, which is extraordinary, actually, after all of this. We're bringing jobs home. In my state, we are cheering about creating manufacturing jobs. And then we want to put the country in a default? Only people that want chaos and want to play politics would even be considering this. So let me just ask, one area that is so great that we are seeing right now is the number of increases in small businesses. We're really seeing a renaissance in small business. More than 12,000 new small business applications were submitted just in April And Mr. Zandi, I wonder if you might speak to how the environment for small business owners would change in the event of a default.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yeah, it is amazing, the small business formation we've seen
amazing.
during the pandemic. It's the one,
Yeah.
it's one very significant bright spot in our economy. And it's across all industries in all regions of the country, really quite incredible to see. But I do fear that small businesses are now under a significant threat. I mean, of course, the banking crisis is a very serious problem because many small banks that are under a lot of pressure are provide credit to small business. I mean, when I started my company, I got my loan from Malvern Federal Savings, my first loan from Malvern Federal Savings Bank, 3 branches, still operating in Malvern, Pennsylvania. So that they're already under a lot of pressure, and with a debt default, you know, the problems here are going to be magnified many times over. The banking crisis will continue on. The availability of credit, the cost of credit will become prohibitive. I think it's going to be very difficult for small businesses to not only operate and thrive, but to actually survive. We will, instead of seeing a significant increase in formation, see a significant increase in bankruptcy and default. I think we should buckle in for some of that anyway, even without the debt limit drama. But with the drama and a breach, that would just be over the top, I think, for small business.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would just say the message we should send today to our Republicans in the Houses, don't default. Come and work with us within the budget process, within appropriations process, within the Farm Bill process. Some of what they did is actually Farm Bill jurisdiction. We'll have that debate. We'll have that debate during the Farm Bill. But don't create chaos in an American economy that's just beginning to thrive here. Thank you.
Which adds the additional benefit of public daylight rather than backroom dealings.
Absolutely.
Senator Romney.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, and thank you to the panelists. A couple of you I know pretty well, respect you all. These comments don't refer to you, but to us, which is, I think, we ought to be embarrassed. This committee ought to be embarrassed, which is the American people expect us to work on a bipartisan basis to address the challenges that America faces, rather than holding hearings that are about preening and posturing and politicizing and trying to blame the other party. It's really embarrassing. This is a committee responsible for setting a budget every year. We're supposed to have already done it. We've never even met to discuss doing that. We don't even have a budget. This is a committee that could be talking about what things we could do to restrain the amount of spending we have, the debt that we're seeing increase. That's a real concern I think people on both sides of the aisle agree on. But we're not doing that. We're coming here saying the obvious, which is, of course, we can't default on our debt, and it would be terrible if we did. We know that. We also know that every time the debt ceiling has been raised in the past, there have been questions about whether we should restrain spending, and about half the time that we've raised the debt ceiling in the past, there's been efforts to, and there have been provisions and agreements to curb spending. We got to find a way to reduce our spending or to deal with our fiscal problems, but instead we're just preening and posturing. I agree with all the people who say it'd be terrible to default on our debt. We're not going to default on our debt. I certainly hope not. It would be awful. But don't forget that could have been solved a long time ago by our Democrat friends simply in their reconciliation bill doing what Leader McConnell asked them to do, which is just raise the debt ceiling yourselves. Didn't need a single Republican vote. Not a single vote. But they chose not to because politicking is the way of this city. And it makes the American people sick. Frankly, it makes a number of us who serve in these positions a little ill as well, that we're in a setting with such critical issues being faced, and instead of solving them and working together, I don't think this committee's ever come together since I've been here to sit down, Republicans, Democrats, in these back rooms we talk about where deals are getting done. We've never had a backroom meeting to talk about these things, to negotiate, to talk about how we're going to rein in spending. Look, there's no question but that we're going to have to deal with our entitlements, both on the revenue side and on the spending side. We're going to have to deal with discretionary and non-discretionary spending. But we don't talk about it. We basically just blame the other side. And every year we add another $1 trillion to the debt. Let me just ask, and Mr. Zandi, Dr. Zandi, is it your view and Moody's view that the amount of debt we're adding is ultimately going to become a real problem for the American economy and for the American people and for our ability as a nation to protect ourselves and to have a robust and growing economy. Is this a problem we need to deal with?
These are my views, Senator, not Moody's. And I hear you. I hear your words. They resonate with me. And it's very clear that we're on an unsustainable path fiscally. And it's in our face. It's not 10 years from now. It's not a generation from now. It's now. And I agree. We need to address this both with regard to spending restraint, and you mentioned the entitlement programs, and tax revenue. We can't do it with one without the other. Both have to be done. And I think it's critical that lawmakers come together and talk about this and figure out how to do it. I don't think it should be done or can be done in the context of a debt limit debate. I don't think that's possible. And I think our politics is in a place now that we are increasingly coming to the edge of defaulting, and we will default if we continue down this political path that we're on. We just got to get off that road and come together. And I totally agree with you. We need to stop posturing and we need to start acting.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Riedel, good to see you again and appreciate your help some years ago. Let me ask you the same question. Is this an issue we ought to be addressing and dealing with, which is the excessive spending we have, the borrowing that we're doing, the fiscal challenge, and I realize there are two parts of a fiscal challenge, tax revenue as well as spending. But is this something we ought to make an urgent priority? I saw one group, a nonpartisan group in the House called the No Labels Group. They've said, hey, let's just get a commission together to talk about how we can restrain spending. Isn't this something we ought to be talking about as opposed to just pointing at each other and saying, you're to blame, no, you're to blame, and the debt went higher under Trump. No, it didn't, it went higher under, it's like, guys, solve the problem. Don't just hit each other with brickbats. Is this a challenge we got to deal with?
I mean, Erskine Bowles years ago said this is going to be the most predictable economic crisis in history. Again, we're on pace by the CBO to borrow $114 trillion over the next 30 years under the rosy scenario of peace, prosperity, low interest rates, no new spending, no new tax cuts. $114 trillion. Who's going to lend us $114 trillion? China and Japan have already reduced their holdings to $2 trillion. The Federal Reserve holds $5 trillion. They're not going to monetize it. So are we really going to borrow $100 trillion from domestic investors over the next 100 years? And if we do so, what's going to happen to interest rates and the economy? If Congress doesn't deal with this, the bond market will cut us off at some point, and then it's going to be much more painful.
Thank you. I'd go on a long time, but I already have. So, Mr. Chairman, back to you.
You've been fine, Senator Romney. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to all of you. I wish I shared Senator Romney's optimism about the chances of not defaulting this year. Having been very involved in the 2011 debate, I am much more worried that this time we will go over that cliff. Ms. Hopper, great to see you. Thank you for your work in Maryland. I'm going to start by questioning Mr. Zandi. I think many of us are grateful, Mr. Zandi, for sharing over many years your expertise on fiscal issues. If I could just ask you regarding inflation today. We know we still have work to do in the economy, but inflation has now fallen 40% compared to the peak of last year. It's at a 2-year low. Chairman Powell, Chairman of the Federal Reserve, was recently asked about what he thought the pressures on inflation were at the current time, and he indicated that in his view, it's not fiscal policy that's driving inflation now. Do you agree?
Agreed. I think the inflation we're suffering through right now is the continued fallout from the impact of the pandemic on supply chains, labor markets, and the Russian war in Ukraine and its impact on energy, food, and other commodity markets. And what's happened is those two shocks conflated and infected inflation expectations and wage and other dynamics in the labor market. So lots of reasons for the high inflation. At the very tippity top is the fact that we're still working through the fallout from those two massive shocks to the supply side of the economy. At this point, I don't think fiscal policy has played any role at all. Just one quick other point. If you had asked me that question back in 2021, I would have said fiscal policy, yes, is playing a role. But at that point, hard to remember back, that was deemed to be good inflation. We had been through a decade of suboptimal inflation. We wanted to see higher inflation. It wasn't an issue.
Let me, I've just, my time's running short.
sorry.
I have a couple more questions.
Yeah.
So I did see your assessment that if you actually passed the House Republican plan, we would lose 790,000 jobs in the economy. Have you had a chance to look at the Biden budget proposal and determine whether it would cause anything in that range of job loss?
No, I mean, they both have deficit reduction long run. Oh, of course, the House legislation on the spending side, the president mostly on the tax side. But in the next, when the economy's, in the next year and a half, when the economy's incredibly vulnerable, the president's budget does not have the same kind of negative consequence. So in longer run, the negative consequence of the higher taxes in the president's budgets, all else being equal, weigh on economic growth, but to a very modest degree compared to the budget cuts that are in the House legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Zanni. Mr. Rydell, you mentioned in your testimony that we actually eliminated our deficits and saw a surplus back around the turn of the century. Do you recall what share revenues were as a percent of GDP when we did that?
Back then, revenues had jumped to 20%, spending fell to about 17%. Essentially, the budget was balanced by a huge defense savings and a revenue bubble. Right. And then the bubble burst and 9/11 happened.
Right. So as you said, at that time, revenues were around 20%.
Correct.
And I think you're aware of the fact that if you look at the current budget and project it out a couple of years, we're talking about 18%. Now, 2% may not sound like a big gap, but when you're putting 2% on top of a huge economy, that's a lot of revenue that we had back in 2000 as a percent of GDP that we do not have today. Here's my question to you. President Biden has put a budget plan on the table. In fact, much more detailed than the plan that passed the House of Representatives. It has $3 trillion in deficit reduction. Do you think President Biden should take the position that he would veto a debt ceiling increase unless he gets his way on how we reduce the deficit by $3 trillion?
I think both sides need to negotiate.
No. That's President, I'm asking you a question because the House has said, if you don't adopt this is our bill, if you don't adopt this, we're going to default.
Right.
I'm asking you, should President Biden take that position and say, if you don't reduce the deficit my way by $3 trillion, by raising taxes on very rich people, increasing taxes on corporations to actually lower than it was a number of years ago, and requiring that prescription drug companies contribute more so Medicare pays less. Should he say, if you don't adopt my plan, I'm not going to sign a debt ceiling increase?
I think the president should say, we need to adopt a deficit reduction plan. I've made an opening offer, but I'm flexible to negotiate.
And if we don't do that, we should default. He should say that.
I don't think anyone should say.
Well, that is what the House Republicans are saying. And so why you have number 3 point in your testimony, avoid a default at all costs, that is not what the House Republicans are saying. They're saying if you don't adopt our plan, we will default. That is reckless. You know it, others know it, and the president knows it, which is why he hasn't taken the position that it's either his way or the highway. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Marshall.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's not a single person on our side of the aisle that wants the country to default on its debt. I want the American public to know that. There's not one of us that wants to default on our debt. But we also want to see responsible spending, and we know we cannot give the White House another credit card. Look, we can walk and chew gums. We can solve both problems. Why does it have to be either or? Why does this Capitol Hill live working in silos? I'll never understand it. What we can't do is push this problem onto my grandchildren and cripple their generation with burdensome debt and interest payments. And for the life of me, I don't understand why my colleagues across the aisle want to destroy future generations, all so that they can function as climate demigods. Let me tell you what I'm talking about. Jupiter is the Roman god of climate and weather. Indra was the Hindu god. Horus, the Egyptian god of climate and weather. Zeus, the Greek mythology god. I ask you, who's America's climate god? Is it John Kerry? Is it Al Gore? Why do we have this religious experience with climate rather than using common sense, talking about affordability, reliability, and all the while America's carbon footprint is going down? Today's White House and the Democrat Party have become the European Green Socialist Party. That's who they are today. They worship climate. And even the bank's meltdowns have been impacted by their worship of climate. Even our own Federal Reserve is upside down now, ignoring the same interest rate risk problems that Silicon Valley Bank ignored, all impacted by their climate worship. I just can't tell you enough how much I'm disappointed by the name of this hearing, the Default on America Act, blackmail, brinkmanship, and billionaire backroom deals. I don't know if I could come up with a more misleading and unjust title for a hearing. Again, there's not a single person on this side of the aisle that wants us to default on our debt. There's been no backroom deals, no brinkmanship. There's been no blackmail involved in this bill sent to us from our colleagues in the House. I believe the House GOP bill is a good solution. And let me be absolutely clear, there's no cuts to the VA or veterans benefits in the House Republican proposal, despite the lies coming from the left to the contrary. Democrats' fear-mongering and scare tactics using our veterans as political pawns are beneath the office we've been elected to serve. And of course, Republicans are going to keep fighting to protect and save Medicare and Social Security from White House policies that cut funding to those programs and dilute the resources. The irony is that is your side of the aisle that truly knows a thing or two about backroom deals. You got a marvelous warm-up with the American Rescue Plan and truly refine the art of the art with the also misnamed Inflation Reduction Act. What a joke. While drafting the IRA in secret, behind closed doors, there were no hearings. No bills, no debate, and no discussion. 1 minute there was no bill. The next we're voting on a sprawling wish list of the EU socialist Green Party agenda items, like saddling small oil and gas producers in Kansas with devastating methane fees that won't have any impact on the environment. I'd love to have a real debate about methane in this room, in this hearing. I'm here to tell you what won't work. I care too much about my children and my grandchildren and my parents and hardworking Americans already suffering by 15% overall inflation since Democrats took control of government policy. The American people and the national media know that the ball is in Joe Biden's court. Speaker McCarthy and the House GOP have put a deal on the table that claws back reckless government spending and hopefully will slow inflation while taking care of the debt ceiling for a year. That's a win-win opportunity. A deal's on the table. These are good things that the American people want and deserve. Our country cannot keep up racking up debt on the backs of hardworking Americans. We must face this head on. And all we're asking is that the Democrats stop all the political theatrics long enough to participate in a good faith negotiations so we can pay America's bills. We can do both. If anybody's listening today, I want to remind them, when it comes to addressing America's debt crisis, Republicans have done something and put forth a solution. Democrats have not. Mr. Riedel, what would your advice be to the president right now?
My advice to the president is to sit down and negotiate. The American people at least want to have a discussion, and he should sit down and negotiate with an open mind towards raising the debt limit and reducing a deficit that both sides can.
And the deal on the table does both of those. The deal that the Republicans on the House side have put forward does both of those, responsible spending and solves the debt limit crisis.
It raises the debt limit and it addresses the deficit.
Thank you.
Senator Merkley.
I yield back.
Oh, for the record, since I sit on the Finance Committee also, and since I sit on the Environment and Public Works Committee, let me just note that the tax credit provisions in the IRA came through the Finance Committee, were publicly debated in the Finance Committee, were voted on in the Finance Committee, and the methane program came out of the Environment and Public Works Committee based on my methane fee, which was also a matter of a lot of conversation in the Environment and Public Works Committee.
So we want to have that debate as well today?
No, just correcting the record that there was in fact a lot of committee public action on the measures that ended up in the IR.
When did we get the bill?
Senator Merkley.
When did we get the bill from the time we got it till we voted? How much time passed?
The provisions were clear well before and were subject
Was
to
it minutes
hearing
or
and debate.
seconds?
Hearing and debate months before.
My colleague from Utah, Mitt Romney, said, why can't we figure out a path forward? And here we are. It's very clear that many people on my side of the aisle think we need to reduce the deficit by raising revenue from those who pay the least, that is, the rich and the corporations. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say we want to do it on spending cuts. And I'm taken back in time to 1974. This committee exists because of the bill that was passed in 1974. And that bill, which was titled the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act, passed with 100% of the senators, every single senator, both sides of the aisle. And the deal was, for reducing the deficit, only for reducing the deficit, we will create a filibuster-free pathway. Now, you might recall that there was intense supporters of the filibuster, and yet every single one of them said, for one purpose, decreasing the deficit, we will have a filibuster-free pathway. And that held for 20 years. And you of all, as experts in this area, I'm sure are well familiar with what happened. And what happened was 1996. In 1996, you have the Gingrich Revolution, and we had essentially a series of bills. One of them was a line item veto bill, and that was struck down by the Supreme Court. We also had a debate over a balanced budget amendment, and that fell one vote short here in the Senate from passing and failed. And then at that point, the Senate pivoted, the Senate leadership pivoted at that point and said, let's do a massive revenue reduction, a tax cut, a massive tax cut. Well, Democrats said no, and so the Republicans in this body said, you know what, let's use that filibuster-free pathway from 1974. And they proceeded to ask Robert Dove, the parliamentarian, for a ruling that instead of using that filibuster-free pathway for deficit reduction, they could use it for a tax cut that would increase the deficit. And they got the ruling they wanted. Robert Dove was previously an employee of Robert Dole, and he conceded, we will change this purpose. It was challenged, and there was a vote on the floor, and the vote was sustained by the majority. The ruling was sustained by the majority. And now we had, after 22 years, we blew up this bipartisan strategy of only using this for deficit reduction. That opened the door to what we did last year with the Inflation Reduction Act, in which Democrats said, well, it's going to be used for the Republican priorities to increase the deficit. Hell, we'll use it for our priorities to increase the deficit, our particular things that we would like to see accomplished that are important to America. I just want to give this history because we quickly lose track of that this has been a struggle that we have been engaged in for 50 years. And there was a pretty significant legislation in 1974 saying deficit reduction. We don't agree on how to do it, but it's so important we will create this sacred, protected, filibuster-free highway. And then it got blown up in 1996. And here we are kind of having the same question on how do we reclaim that. The former chair of this committee from North Dakota, he proceeded to change the rule back to saying it could only be used for deficit reduction. Kent Conrad rule. And immediately, as soon as the Democrats were out of power here, Republicans changed it back. And so there's a lot of posturing over who's right and who's wrong. The fact is we have failed as a Senate to wrestle with this, and we blew up the one tool we'd come together universally to support. And are you all familiar with this history, Dr. Zandi?
I'll have to say I forgot a lot of it, but that was very helpful, yeah.
And Dr. Fichtner, this is in your bailiwick?
Yeah, Senator, you're spot on. So let me take the moment to, one, thank you for bringing it up and make an offer to the chairman that if the chairman and ranking member want to reintroduce the Bipartisan Congressional Budget Reform Act. I would like nothing better than to spend hours up here testifying about the benefits of biannual budgeting, making the budget resolution stronger, going back to having deficit reduction a priority and how to do that. I would welcome the opportunity, sir.
Well, my commentary to not using, if you will, the debt ceiling in this fashion, in which we hold each other hostage. This has happened because we blew up the common collective tool that we worked out in 1974 and that worked for 22 years. And so this is a very dangerous path we're on. We're on a game of chicken, and it may very well blow up the economy. And I'm a blue-collar kid, still live in a blue-collar community, and I'm thinking about the folks who have the car loans on they have adjustable rate mortgages, they're worried about the interest rates on their student loans, and they're all going to be really hurt. Not a lot of people have stock, but some of them have some stock through we're fortunate to have an IRA or something to that, and so they have that little bit of savings there. They're going to be hurt on that if the stock market crashes. So I don't know how to put this back together, because even if we were to recreate the 74 bill, that 74 consensus, what we now know is that under political pressure, one party or the other, and it could be the blue side or the red side, is going to get a ruling from a parliamentarian and blow it up and use it exactly the opposite way that it was intended as a moment of political convenience. So I think the right way to deal with this is that we wrestle with spending bills, and those require bipartisan cooperation because they're subject to 60 votes unless we're doing it through reconciliation. We wrestle with the revenue side. If those things, that's what produces a deficit, the difference between revenue and spending. And so, but when the bill comes due, I'm always reminded of President Reagan saying, "You do not mess with the American debt." And I'm not sure how he phrased, but basically with American credit. I'm out of time. I actually wanted to ask a bunch of questions, but I wanted to bring up that piece of history because it's relevant to what this committee does and wrestles with and the impasse we're at today.
It is important history, and as I turn to Senator Scott, I would say we actually got pretty close with NZ Whitehouse. It made it into the bicameral bipartisan debt commission, and it passed there in bipartisan fashion, as I recall, perhaps even unanimously, and then neither body took it up on the floor. So don't think that there isn't an avenue to complete the work that so many have talked about. It is there. Senator Scott, thank you for your patience.
Thanks for the history. I knew most of it, but it's good to have a reminder. I became governor of Florida, and everybody thinks these states balance their budgets. They don't. My state had not balanced its budget in the 20 years before I became governor, and I walked into the $4 billion budget deficit, not as big as the federal one, but we just said this is what our revenue base is going to be, and we figured out how to allocate the dollars, and we actually were able to grow our economy, and as a result, we paid off a third of the state debt in 8 years. So I've been up here 4 years, and I think the most frustrating thing is that we don't do budgets. We don't even, we don't even have a fight over the spending bills. We just get these bills, these spending bills, and it's not like one side's bad and the other side's good. Both sides have been doing this. And then we just get it, like I think what Senator Marshall is, it's not just that bill, but all these things. It happened when Republicans controlled. We had these omnibus bills that we had no power to make them, never went through a committee or anything. So for each of you, so we have almost $32 trillion of debt. What's the limit? So I guess our GDP is around 26. So whether it's a dollar amount or whether it's percentage of GDP, what do you guys think? What's the limit? In my experience, at least, is that when we raise taxes, we never get the revenues. Mm-hmm. So, because I want everybody to pay their fair share and figure out how to balance this, but we never get the revenues. We ever say, and the other people say, well, if we do this, we're going to save money. We never get the savings either. So, what do you guys think the limit is? Maybe we just go this way.
Sure, I'll start. Thank you, Senator. Many of us have been calling for this to be a problem for years, and I think one day I'm going to be right. I'm just not sure when that day comes. But I'll tell you now where I think it's going to happen is 2033, because that's when the Social Security Retirement Trust Fund becomes depleted. And that's when, if no action is taken by Congress, we're going to have to borrow $350 billion a year to make up the difference in general revenue shortfalls if we don't raise taxes or cut benefits, which I don't think Congress will do at the last minute. That's when you're going to start seeing the bond markets interact and say, this borrowing could go on for how much longer? And that's where I think we're going to start hitting our
So the Congressional Budget Office, I think, has this, if we continue the path we're going down, we would be at, what, 48, something like that? $1 billion of debt on top of that. What about you?
Yeah, I think once the debt gets up to 150 to 200% of GDP, you're really in rare territory with the global economy and with the experience of other countries. I mean, just to put a number on it, imagine we get to 200% of GDP and we have a 5% interest rate. You're paying 10% of GDP in interest. Well, if revenues are usually, what, 17, 18, 19% of GDP, you're in rough shape if the majority of your revenue is just paying interest. So you don't want to get to that point. The bond market may cut you off before you get there, but even if they don't, you don't want to be paying 10% of GDP just in interest.
So I'm the lawyer, not the economist, so I'm going to defer to my colleagues here.
I think the way I would think about it is it's not a cliff event, it's a corrosive on the economy. And a good rule of thumb, and this is empirically based with a lot of debate, and CBO comes pretty close, is that for every percentage point increase in the debt to GDP ratio, it adds about 2 basis points to 10-year Treasury yields. So just to make that concrete,
On average.
and it's not linear over time. But that feels roughly right. So if you go up 10 percentage points, you add 20 basis points. But if you do the arithmetic here, obviously the corrosive it undermines the economy, out in the long run. So we clearly have to change this.
So let me ask you another question. We're at, I guess we're a little over 6 times debt to what we're anticipate we'll collect in revenues, right? How much of your net worth would you invest in a company like that? So how many of you are buying 30-year treasuries right now? Anybody? Anybody buying 3-year?
Not 30-year.
What would you buy?
I have great faith in you that you will resolve this and that the U.S. will remain the.
I'm hopeful.
No, I would invest, and by the way, so does the rest of the world. We still are the AAA credit on the planet. Money comes here when times are tough, and that's because when times are tough, we ultimately do the right thing.
It does say something when nobody's sitting here saying they would buy 30-year treasuries, because we're supposed to be the safest investment in the world.
And a lot of money is held right now in cash, sir, just paying a good interest rate for money market
Well,
funds.
I'd say a lot of people are buying U.S. Treasury debt at this point. But now now I will say this, if you look at yields on short-term Treasury securities, 1 month, 3 month, you can see the yields are now rising and falling based on when investors think it's possible that we do default on the debt. So the idea that people don't think we're going to default, that's slowly breaking down here. At some point, it's going to become a problem.
And I would add China and
supposedly
Japan
worse than any time in our history.
Yeah, I mean, you look at 1 month versus 3 month Treasury, it's a beautiful chart. You should take a look at it. I mean, in fact, it's in my written testimony. It's unprecedented. So investors, and then you can look at Treasury security yields by day, and people are now looking at, when receipts are coming in, when expenditures are going out, and they could say, oh, on this day, it's the most likely day that the Treasury is going to run out of cash, and therefore I'm not going to get paid.
It's probably positive. People are getting engaged.
Right? It's absolutely critical that they get engaged.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Lujan, then Senator Brown, then Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to everyone that's here in person and also helping us electronically to be here today with the panelists. It's been a good discussion, one that I've appreciated and learned from. I want to take this back to what the Republican legislation that was passed this last week, which I think similar to 2017 when the American people dubbed the Trump tax policy as a tax scam that was promised to to be targeting middle class and those aspiring to be in the middle class, to prioritize them. I mean, the proof is in the pudding, and everyone knows where that money went. And to the dissatisfaction of many constituents I represent, they were trying to figure out how to submit their taxes the next year because the withholding tables changed a little bit, and less was taken from their checks. But when April 15th came, they were thinking what happened last year was going to probably happen again, and it didn't. And it hurt their budgets. So I hope that when we talk about budgets, we also include the budgets of the people that we represent when we're talking about this. And with me saying that, I don't know if the chair knows or if any of you know, do you know how many U.S. senators went to Head Start? There's 2. There's only 2 U.S. senators that went to Head Start. I'm one of them. Now, I think that if those programs would have been stronger in other parts of the country, colleagues would have benefited from them as well. But nonetheless, I bring that up because this Default on America Act that came through the House recently would dramatically reduce and eliminate investments in Head Start. I've heard economist after economist tell me that one of the greatest returns on a dollar is an investment in education in children. Dr. Zandi, does what I say hold true?
Yes, I mean, there's very strong academic research that shows that investments in young children, pay off enormously, not only for their financial well-being, but for the communities they live in and for the broader economy.
I appreciate you sharing that. I know that I benefited from this education, and I didn't realize until later in life what opportunity that I had that presented itself to my family. Not just that I was able to get a jump start, if you will, on those classes and socializing with other students, and the power of a nap. I think that America could learn something about that on occasion. But during those Head Start days, to ensure that I could learn a little bit more. And look, we sometimes had a little lunch that would be available to us too, to keep us nourished and keep us strong, which would help us learn more. But my parents also didn't need to find childcare for me when I was growing up, which let them stay in the workplace and work more. That sounds like good economic policy to me. And so what I wanted to raise, Mr. Chairman, was my concern associated with the devastating cuts that were listed in these programs in the area of early childhood education. But one other area I wanted to raise that's not been raised just yet is, as a reminder to all of us, the United States has a treaty obligation to tribal nations in America. That the United States has a horrible track record of meeting. The plan that came out of the House would devastate investments into tribal communities. A $1 billion cut to Indian Health Service, $60 million cut to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, $200 million cut to the Bureau of Indian Education. And I certainly hope that we're having this conversation as all this moves forward. Now, when I was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 2008, I proudly supported PAYGO, a simple policy that was instituted in 2006 that was moved forward through 2008, and then it was erased. The majorities changed, and it went away. But that's a pretty simple policy that I think that everyone across America can understand. If you're going to buy something, you got to pay for it. And so while I'm not as smart as all the folks that I learned from, I know that. I think that's a strength of mine. I surround myself with smart people. But I also understand simple concepts. And if we can go back to, there's an acronym, I'll leave the last S off. But if you can keep it simple and we can all come together and do some things, we can make things better. And so, Mr. Chairman, I apologize for my approach to some of this, but I think sometimes we just need to step into the shoes of the people that we represent and try to communicate in a way that complex policy takes them into consideration when we have to make these really tough decisions. I thank you for the time. I yield back.
No apology needed, Senator Lujan. You have a very important voice. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To put into context, this is the Budget Committee. And at least today, I think we're talking about budget. I've been on it as the committee I was most interested in being on since I got here 4.5 years ago. And we've not even gotten to first base on a budget resolution that was accepted broadly, let alone a budget. So I'd like to ask the chairman of the Budget Committee, this senator here had to take as a privileged motion a budget to the floor about a year ago. And that's when it doesn't get done in the regular order of business. Would you commit to you and I at least working when the new fiscal year starts on October 1st, that we will bring a budget to the Senate floor that we craft here and spend the time on the Budget Committee through regular order, like you do everywhere else, to get a budget that we would at least get out of this committee?
I'm going to have to wait and see how the present circumstance plays out, because if the House Republicans set off the default hand grenade that they are negotiating with right now, we are in a very different world, and I can't predict that world.
Let's assume that
But
doesn't
what
happen.
What I've
would you?
already said I will do is to get back to work on the NZ White House budget reform proposal that can lead in that direction and set up the terms for precisely the conversation you want. I think we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
My recollection is that you were favorable. Senator Kane has been here. I think we've got some real bipartisan interests there, and I will pursue that. I think we're pretty comfortable with the president's budget. So I don't know that we need to do more. That's now between the White House.
I think if we still have a budget committee, we ought to use it through regular order to at least put something out there. The other House needs to do that as well. So let's get to what I've observed. Other places, everywhere else, you don't have the printing press in the basement, and you do not have a credit card that is automatically renewable. I think that's the context that we work within here. Obviously, that would be pandemonium anywhere else. Sooner or later, things like your sovereign currency are at risk. We saw what happened in Europe when Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy fell off the wagon not too many years ago, got them back in line. And my observation has been that the ability for our unique economy to raise revenue, we ought at least look to see what that maximum amount would be without threatening economic growth. And here's a statistic that I have not heard anyone mention, that is over 50 years, regardless of the tax rate, we generate about 17.5% to 18% of our GDP in revenue. So that means through high rates, obviously, you get lower economic growth. The Trump tax cuts, those were chump change. If you give the full $150 billion to them, that would only be 7% or so of our current structural deficits. So my question is going to be to every one of you, and give me a fairly brief answer because I'm going to have another one. Is that a reasonable place to be than to where we just live within it? Is there more capacity? Is there not? Tell me why. Only 3 times, I think, during the Clinton years did we hit 20% of our GDP in tax revenue. We'll start over with Mr. Zandi.
I think there's more room. I think the average revenue to GDP is about 18%, but I think there's more room, and there needs to be because of the aging of the population. There's more folks that need Social Security and Medicare, and that is a significant, just keeping spending per person constant in real dollars.
Where, do you have a level that you think that you'd be comfortable with that wouldn't strain economic growth and that would be reasonable?
Yeah, I think somewhere between 20 and 22% in that range. Yeah, I think that'd go a long way to addressing our long-term fiscal issues. But we need spending restraint on top of that.
And by the way, that would be about 3 to 5% lower than where we're currently at, with $7 trillion divided by our, what is our GDP, like 26 trillion roughly?
25.
Okay, so we're way above 25% currently, and that's not sustainable. Ms. Hooper, what do you say?
Of course, I was talking long run, not.
Yes, I know long run. Ms. Hopper.
Yes, I would say I am the attorney, not the economist again, so I will defer to my colleagues here.
Okay.
I've modeled out the tax numbers, and you could probably get to about 20% of GDP tops, especially on terms of taxing the rich. You can throw every proposal out there that we've seen on taxing the rich. You'll get about 2% of GDP from that. And with spending going to 30% of GDP, you got a ways to go.
And I'll echo Mr. Rito's point. In my lifetime, basically, the long-term average for revenues, it averages 17.4%, to your point. When you get above 18, there's calls for tax cuts. When you get below, there's calls for revenue increases. That's kind of the historical. Even if we have range going up to 20, let's just give ourselves that there's some flexibility to go to 20. 2033, we're going to have 25% of GDP in outlays. That's the big gap. So you can't make it up all on revenue.
So right here, historically, we've got 18%. Let's round it up a 0.5%. We have one witness that says 20 to 22%. We're currently approaching 30%. So, Mr. Chairman, I would think that one simple way to get bipartisanship would be to at least establish what the capability is of this federal government and then live within it. Because otherwise, you're ending up basing this on an increasingly indebted economy, which now puts us only number 2 to Japan in terms of percentage of debt, debt as a percentage of our GDP. And to me, that's a shameful, bad business plan that is not sustainable.
Since I was asked the question, I'll take a minute of Chairman's time before I turn to Senator Padilla to say that the way that the NZ White House program worked was very aligned with what you have just said, Senator Braun. It was, I think everybody agrees that debt to GDP is the right metric to be looking at. I see all the economist heads nodding, all three. And then the question is, what debt level for the GDP is the appropriate one? And that's something on which we can have a civilized and thoughtful and sensible discussion informed by experts. And once you've determined what the range of a suitable debt to GDP ratio is, you then have to figure out how quickly you can get there without destroying the economy along the way, because sudden, brutal cut shocks to the economy, like the House has proposed, as Dr. Zandi has said, will cost 700,000 jobs and put us into recession. So that's not a smart way to get there. You've got to have a glide slope, and then you've got to think about how do you enforce the glide slope with warnings that you're off the glide slope, and then you have the revenue and spending discussions. And that's
Mr.
the way
Chairman,
we should
when
pursue that.
just not too long ago,
I've got to yield to Senator Padilla. It's his
are
time.
you going to do another round or?
Sure, you can stick around, but it's Senator Padilla's time now. So, Senator Padilla, excuse my intervention in your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just make up for it on the back end.
Everybody else has, why not you?
Let me also try to sort of level set not just the conversation we're having here today, but why we're having it here. Despite the slimmest of majorities in the House of Representatives, Republicans are effectively saying to President Biden and to Senate Democrats and the American people that we must either accept their ransom demands or they'll force the country to default on its debt for the first time in history. Let's be clear that the hostage they're taking or threatening to take isn't the federal government. It's the American people, including their own constituents. A default would plunge our economy into recession. All the economists have established that, costing millions of American jobs, increasing loan payments for working families on everything from their homes to cars to student loans, and threatens to cut Social Security and healthcare payments as a result. So much of what we're discussing here today, as big and significant as it may sound, is frankly only scratching the surface of what the country will face should Republicans refuse to allow the federal government to meet its obligations. Let me ask questions about some of the specifics. So as we saw during a recent hearing with OMB Director Shalonda Young, Republicans take great offense at the idea that they would cut Social Security and Medicare. And yet, because of this manufactured crisis that would result in seniors not receiving their Social Security and Medicare benefits that they have paid into their entire life and they have earned, a default would keep the federal government from actually paying them out. Mr. Zandi, can you describe the implications for Social Security and Medicare if the federal government defaults on its debts?
Of course, it would be devastating. I mean, the first thing that would happen is people wouldn't receive their checks on time. They'll eventually get the money, but it'll take longer and longer for that to occur, the longer that the impasse continues. Obviously, the hit to financial markets would be serious immediately. In fact, that's already going to start to happen even before we breach the debt limit, because investors are going to anticipate that the breach. Stock prices will decline, interest rates will rise, and of course that undermines the financial well-being of all Americans, but most significantly those retirees that are going to count on that. And then ultimately it's going to cost jobs, the economy, income, and that will affect obviously all Americans in the entire global economy, and Social Security recipients, Medicare recipients would be casualties like everybody else as a result of that.
Right. Now, I was planning to raise an issue of veterans, and I'm glad that Senator Marshall made reference to it in his remarks, because my understanding is that nowhere in the House Republicans' Default on America Act does it say that veterans' benefits are exempt from the 22% cut in domestic spending, right? So we covered Social Security, covered Medicare. Now let's talk about veterans' benefits. It would have been perfectly straightforward to write such an exemption in the bill. In fact, House Democrats offered 2 amendments in the House Rules Committee to protect veterans' benefits from spending cuts. And as we watched that committee do its work, we saw House Republicans vote down those offered amendments. They did, however, rewrite the bill to protect ethanol subsidies. So it seems pretty clear to me that House Republicans made a conscious choice to subject veterans' benefits to their spending cuts, despite protests to the contrary. Back to you, Mr. Zandi. Can you identify a provision in the Default on America Act that would exempt veterans' benefits from the spending cuts proposed by House Republicans?
Not that I'm aware of. The cuts are to total discretionary spending. So that would include defense, non-defense VA benefits. So that would be determined in the appropriations process. But in the legislation, I'm not aware of any language related to the VA program.
Right, no. Exactly. And look, Mr. Chairman, in the interest of time, I can go on and on with other specific examples. Republicans have put us in this place of a looming crisis. We can and should do what we've done numerous times before under Democratic and Republican administrations and pass a clean lifting of the debt ceiling. But to hold it hostage for a budget conversation is wrong, and the exact budget plan not being offered or suggested or considered, but passed by House Republicans would only make a horrible, horrible situation that much worse. We can outline further examples, but the examples most talked about, Social Security, Medicare, veterans' benefits, despite the belly aching on the other side, are clearly on the chopping block. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. That more or less concludes the hearing, except that Senator Braun asked for additional time, and I will gladly, as chair, yield it to him. Then I will offer some concluding remarks, and that'll be the end of this. And thank you very much for the witnesses' testimony and participation. Senator Braun.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in 2019, we spent about $4.5 trillion. 2020, we did the CARES Act, and that was bipartisan. Everyone agreed out of uncertainty, kind of an emergency. I think we spent too much there. And we didn't need, if we had not shut the economy down to the extent we did, now that we know the healthcare information that came around sooner or later, $6.5 trillion. But then you've got 21, 22, and 23. So is it legitimate to get off of the baseline of where we were before with trillion-dollar structural deficits when we were spending $4.5 trillion, taking in about $3.5? Do we need to keep at a level that was based upon something extra normal? Is it healthy, and can we cede the territory that we need to be where we are to have a healthy federal government, and should it be occupying that much of our GDP? So in other words, just because you were able to spend it and borrow the money to do it, is that the new baseline that we should operate on that takes us up to 25% plus of our GDP? Or should we go back to where we were before the extra normal spending took place in the first place? We'll start over with Mr. Zandy again.
Well, those are a lot of numbers.
But that's where we are. Those are actuals.
I need a spreadsheet to disentangle all of that. But let me just say this, Senator. The fiscal problems we have today are ecumenical. They're both Republican and Democrat.
I'd agree.
The Trump tax cuts were $2 trillion, and they were not paid for.
Well, and that's $200 billion over 10 years, so put it in per year.
The fiscal response to the pandemic, which was bipartisan up until the American Rescue Plan, but in 2020, that was an additional $3 trillion, ecumenical. Both sides agree to that. And then the $2 trillion in the ARP, that was Democrats.
Yep.
So it's the situation we're in now is both on both parties.
And I'm talking about going ahead.
And
go back to the original baseline, or should we be at the elevated level?
I think we need to get government, I don't know precisely where it should go, because I have to look at the numbers more carefully, but that the spending as a share of GDP has to get back down to something close to 20 to 22%. Where I think revenue should be is where spending's got to get. And it shouldn't get there next year. It doesn't need to get there in the next 5 years. It doesn't even need to get there in the next 10. But there has to be a clear path to that over the next 10, 20 years. If we can accomplish that, if you can accomplish that, we're golden.
20 to 22%. What about the other panelists?
I think spending has grown rapidly in the last couple of years, and I will add that discretionary appropriations themselves have grown 23.4% in the past 2 years. And so the idea that any cut to discretionary appropriations is going to be a devastating starving of the government, it's grown 23.4% in 2 years. I don't know how that level has to be the sacred floor that will cause chaos if we go below it. I think that at some point we have to align spending growth with the economy and the fundamentals and the deficit.
Well, Senator, I'll make my answer quick. I work for the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are the only organization in the District of Columbia with the word bipartisan in its title. Now, as an economist, I'm not sure that's a supply problem or a demand problem, but it is a problem. And what I would come back to is say, with the chairman's offer to sort of put back in the NC White House bill, and your point about trying to get a process in place is very, very important. And that should be, in some ways, get the debt ceiling, get a budget, make that priority number 3, Mr. Chairman. To your point about where we should go back to, it is pre-COVID baseline. We all kind of agree here that somewhere tax revenues may, and I'll use the word may, be able to go up to 20%. I'm not sure we can do 22, but maybe 20, and spending should be close to that. Spending averages about 21% of GDP on average, right? So you get that little range you have.
So most of our heavy lifting has to address spending, and it's a question of timing, how you get it back to a sustainable level.
And also think about the incidence of tax and where you could have different sort of tax policy. Maybe think about a carbon tax or a financial transaction tax instead of relying on labor so much or income for your tax revenue.
Thank you.
And here to that last comment, may I say. First of all, let me thank Senator Braun for his, I think, extremely sincere and thoughtful interest in all of this. And I particularly appreciate his efforts in this regard and hope that we can work together. I was delighted to hear my ranking member say that he was interested in pursuing this, and to have bipartisan witnesses both saying that reviving the NZ White House idea of a proper procedure that gets to debt to GDP over time, which, as Dr. Zandy just said, could be, we're golden. That would be a better outcome than we're looking at right now. So let me turn to the particularly bad side of where we are right now in my closing remarks. If we end up going into this Republican-threatened default and all the pain and calamity that all of the witnesses have forecast comes to pass, people in America are going to want to know who is responsible. And this is a personal comment. Do not blame any of the other Democrats, and certainly I don't think it would be logical to blame any of my Republican friends. But my hard-earned experience tells me that when the Republican Party acts on pollution-related and corruption-related issues, the party acts as the glove for fossil fuels' dark hand. Essentially, every movement of the glove can be explained by the movement of the underlying fossil fuel industry hand. So House Republicans have armed the default hand grenade and pulled the pin and have it in their hands, threatening to blow it up with all of the consequences that each of you have forecast. And the question is, for whom? Edgar Allan Poe wrote about the purloined letter. Where was it found? In plain view. Look in plain view. What is in plain view in this bill? What is in plain view in the House Default on America Act is 275 out of 315 pages that are giveaways to the fossil fuel industry. The fossil fuel hand in the Republican glove. If we go there, if this default is provoked by what looks like a desperate last attack on clean energy competition, by a massive polluting and heavily political industry, that will come back to them. There will be a story to tell. People will be looking at this, and I promise that I will do everything in my power to connect the dots so that the American people clearly see the dark fossil fuel industry hand behind the Republican glove in the Default on America Act. 275 out of 315 pages is one hell of a tell. And with that, I will conclude the hearing. If any members have questions for the record for the witnesses, we ask that they be in by noon tomorrow. The witnesses, if you receive questions for the record, are requested to provide your responses within a week. And may I hope that we reconvene in brighter days with the pin back in the hand grenade and go forward on a bipartisan path to do the work that I think has been quite well outlined in the subtext, if not the